right, so why? Well, it turns out that maybe the biggest thing that tells us how much money you're going to make in your life is what your parents were. Because there's a very high correlation between your parents' socioeconomic status and your socioeconomic status. If your parents are middle class, it's a pretty good chance you're going to be. If your parents are poor, it's a pretty good chance you're going to be. And if your parents are rich, it's a pretty good chance you're going to be. If your daddy leaves you $500 million, you're probably going to be rich. Okay? Just saying. The next biggest thing is education. The more education you have, the higher your income on average. Okay? Why do you go to college? Well, yeah, you make over $1 million. The average college graduate will make over $1 million more in their life than the average high school graduate. Over $1 million more. Plus, you're far less likely to end up in jail, far less likely to end up unemployed, far less likely all sorts of bad things happen to you. But the more education you get on average, the higher your income is. The type of household you live in, it turns out that, well, if you haven't figured this out, marriage is the primary cause of divorce. Yeah, I don't know anyone who's divorced who wasn't married at some point. Marriage seems to be the primary cause of divorce. And there's fewer and fewer people who get married in the United States every year as a percent. But married households do much better than single persons or unmarried households. Okay, married people have better economic outcomes over the course of their lives. Age has something to do with it. As you get older, your income goes up until you get into your 50s, late 50s, and then people's income starts to go down. The last thing you want to do is get fired when you're 60 years old, because the chance of you finding another job that's anything like the job you just gave up is very low. Okay? Gender, race, and ethnicity play a big part in how our income goes, and you can look at the government statistics, and we'll look at some of them in a second. The average woman makes 82% of what the average man makes in the United States, and if we adjust for experience and everything else, it still works out to be about 8%. Okay? And the same sort of stuff is true if you're a person of color. On average, for the same age and experience and everything, you're going to, on average, make less, okay? Which is an indicator that there's gender and race discrimination in the United States, okay? Where you live is a big deal. If you live in rural Alabama, you're not likely to make as much money as if you live in Denver or live in Los Angeles, live in New York, right? There's just greater economic opportunity some places, okay? Is that exciting? And then again, as we talked about gender, race, and ethnicity, discrimination plays a role in all this. And we should talk about that. So this guy is Gary Becker. He's dead too. It seems like everybody we talk about is dead. We'll have to get you some live people. But Gary Becker developed an actual economic theory of discrimination. And he says, look, discrimination means that you are willing to pay a cost to avoid a group. You're willing to pay a cost to avoid a group. That's discrimination. You're willing to pay a cost to avoid a group. Okay? So I have a friend who was the first woman to ever be a craps dealer at Caesars. And she worked for a day. And the reason she worked for a day is because some big high roller, some rich dude walked up to the table, saw a woman craps dealer, and went on a tirade about, I'm not, working with some, and he called her names and stuff. And instead of Caesars saying, she's a fine employee who will do a good job, they went, oh, Mr. Rich Guy, we'll put her on another table. And she just quit rather than put up with that nonsense. Okay? If you look at the casinos in Las Vegas, there are certain jobs that men do and there are certain jobs that women do. And generally speaking, the jobs that the women do pay less than the jobs that the men do. And Okay? So what happens in the labor market when there's discrimination? Well, let's look at let's say that businesses only are going to hire white workers, that some businesses in this industry are only going to hire white people to work in their store. The people who run these businesses discriminate, and they're not going to hire people of color, and they're only going to hire white people. Well, that means the demand for white people rises, yes, and the wages of white people rise. So white people will, more of them will get jobs, and they'll get paid more. So discrimination automatically means in the marketplace, if there's discrimination in the marketplace, it means the group that's not being discriminated against is going to make more money, and more of them are going to have jobs. Okay? Does that make sense? They're going to make more money. Wages and employment rise for the white workers. And then, of course, obviously for the non-white workers, they have lower wages and less employment opportunity. Okay? Now, there's a theory about all this. So what should happen? So wages fall for non-white workers. There's a theory, and the guy, and I put his name up here, but it'll pop up last, a man named Thomas Sowell, who, and again, this idea comes from Gary Becker, but Thomas Sowell is the one we associate it with. Economics is a profession that's predominantly white and Asian males. And one of the things that's got to happen in economics is we need more women and we need more people of color in the field so that we study things from more different perspectives, right? We need more diversity in our profession, right? So this guy, Thomas Sowell, who for many years was the only black economist anybody could name, he was the only famous black economist. He worked at UCLA, he was a professor at UCLA. So he tells the following story. So if there's discrimination against black folks in this industry, and most of the companies will only hire white folks, so white folks are getting more jobs and higher wages, the wages for the non-white workers fall. What happens if the market's working correctly? What happens if you have an efficient market? Well, I'm a business person, right? My job is to do what? My job is to earn a profit. Yes? Well, can you see a way I can make money off of this deal? And the answer is I should hire all the non-white workers. I should have a business that's built on the non-white workers because they have lower wages. So my competitor out there is paying more in wages than I am. I can charge lower prices. In theory, I should be able to wipe out the discriminator. These discriminating companies should get beat up by the market because they have to charge higher prices because they're hiring only one particular group of workers. Do we see this? Okay? So the companies that's willing to hire non-white workers will have lower costs and they'll drive the discriminators out of business. And again, so this theory is advanced by Thomas Sowell. He basically got rich by walking around the country saying, there is no discrimination in America because if there was, the market would take care of it. Okay? We're pretty sure that this is not a sign that the market works, but this is a sign that there's inefficiencies in the market. Because clearly there's discrimination, there's gender discrimination, and there's race discrimination in the marketplace, and the market isn't correcting it or hasn't corrected it. Okay? Eventually it should. You know that almost 60% of all college students in America are women. So eventually women should vastly outnumber men in management and all these positions, and hopefully things will change. But so let's talk about some examples of discrimination. Do you recognize the woman here on the left-hand side of our screen? It's Danica Patrick. She was an auto racer. Now she's sort of famous because she's about to get married to Aaron Rodgers, the Packers quarterback. And they live in Malibu, so they're not living in Green Bay. They live in Malibu. But she ran an IndyCar. She almost won the Indy 500. She ran out of gas on the last lap of the Indy 500. She would have won it. She won races in IndyCar. Sat on the pole of the Indianapolis 500. Went over to NASCAR, sat on the pole of the Daytona 500. Never won a race, but did okay. Is there discrimination in NASCAR? Well, there's one black driver right now and no women drivers. So maybe. Everybody else is a white guy. But in NASCAR, one of the things that drivers do is they bump other drivers to get past them. They bump them. Well, there's two ways you can bump the other driver. You can bump them just so that it slows them down a little and you can get past, or you can bump them and wipe them out. Well, in the years that Danica Patrick raced, every year she was the person who most often got bumped to crash. She got hit in the bad way, the worst way, by the other drivers more often than any other driver. So perhaps they didn't like a woman driving around the track. But the biggest racing series in the world is Formula One. Formula One spans the whole world. It's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And the head of Formula One was asked whether he'd like to see Danica Patrick come over and race in Formula One. And let's be clear that the Indy racing series that she was in was about to go bankrupt until she came along. And she saved it. Television ratings were so much higher after her than before her that she literally saved the racing series. So does the head of Formula One go, yeah, that'd be great, we'd get all sorts of money? No. He said, women should be dressed in white like other domestic appliances. So here you have the greatest female auto racer of all time. And when asked whether this guy wanted her in his series, he said, women should be dressed in white like other domestic appliances. Soccer. And it's a boring sport. I know it's a boring sport, and there's no reason to really watch it except occasionally like a World Cup or something because it's so boring. But we have an issue between the U.S. women's national team and U.S. soccer because the women bring in more money. The total amount of money brought into U.S. soccer last year by women was a couple $1 million higher than brought in by the men's team. So the women bring in more money. And they got paid 62% as much as the men's team. The men's team is a bunch of losers. They can't even make the World Cup, much less win it. The women are the best soccer team in the world. And they get paid 62% of the losers on the men's team. They sued, and the judge, a male judge, said, well, you guys agreed to this contract, so it can't be discriminatory, and threw it out. And they're appealing because, unequal bargaining positions and power relations and stuff being what it is, but 62%. Okay? This guy in this picture is a guy named Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was the first African-American player in Major League Baseball in 1947. He has a B on his cap. He played for the Brooklyn Dodgers before they moved out to L.A. He was the MVP of the league. He was, one of the best players in all of baseball. What does it take to break discrimination? And the answer is successful non-discriminators. Once Jackie Robinson comes into the major leagues, and the Dodgers go from being bad to being World Series champions, that forces all the other teams. So when you have one team and then the next year another team adds players and you've got 2 or 3 teams that have African-American players, and all of a sudden those are the best teams in baseball, all the other teams are forced to be non-discriminators even if they don't want to be. They have to stop discriminating. They have to hire African-American players. Okay? But remember also that life is always full of trade-offs, right? And so there was something called the Negro Leagues. There were black leagues and there were white leagues. Okay? And there were lots of players playing in the Negro Leagues and the black leagues. What happens to those leagues when the best players, the best African-American players, go over to Major League Baseball and integrate the white league so they can make more money? Well, the Negro Leagues fold. So there are actually, despite the fact that Jackie Robinson is there and the color barrier is broken and the African-Americans in Major League Baseball are making a lot of money to play baseball, the Negro Leagues collapse, and there are actually fewer African-American athletes playing baseball after Jackie Robinson than before Jackie Robinson. Okay? So there's always winners and losers, trade-offs, pluses, and minuses. The African-American athlete ends up better off because they're getting a lot better pay and they're in the major leagues and they're not being discriminated against. But there's other folks who couldn't play professional baseball anymore because there wasn't a spot for them. Okay? And this last part is Las Vegas. So if you came to Las Vegas in the 50s or 60s or 70s, black folks were not allowed to stay on the Strip. There was a hotel on the west side, out on the west side in city of Las Vegas, out on what's called the west side, called the Moulin Rouge. And you could be in the middle down there in the bottom. You've got Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., which are part of the Rat Pack. This whole deal of the 60s in Vegas. It's all these famous Hollywood guys, and they all performed at the Sands. But Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't allowed to stay in a room at the Sands. He had to go out to the Moulin Rouge and stay at the Moulin Rouge. Okay? So they'd pay him a lot of money. They'd pay Diana Ross a lot of money to come sing in the Supremes. Right? The Strip would pay black entertainers to come and put on shows on the Strip, but they wouldn't let them stay in their hotels. Okay. So that kind of says it all. We're at the end. I should be eating a carrot.